week has gone by. So happy to be here with you all. We've got a lot of things to talk about today, so I'm excited to have you join. I hope everybody's doing well. It was a really lovely day out, like nice and brisk. I got to take the dog for a walk, which was a real treat. If you don't know, we adopted a dog, my husband and I, last month, and he's adjusting well, getting out and trying to get him to meet people and other dogs from a distance. So that was a nice treat this evening. But yeah, we got some important things to talk about, so I want to get started with that. First two things and then we'll get into questions that people sent, and then we'll get into questions that people post in the chat. One thing I want to start with talking about that you might have heard is that there were some articles that were talking about Chris Coons' name being floated to become Secretary of State in a Biden administration. This is not the first time that Chris Coons' name has come up when in reference to becoming Secretary of State. I think first and foremost, it's incredibly important that Delaware voters know whether Chris Coons plans to accept this offer before we even vote in September. And I think that if Chris Coons can't pledge to refuse that offer for any presidential appointment, he should do the right thing and shouldn't be running in a Senate primary. I believe that Chris Coons needs to confirm that he will that he will serve out this 6-year Senate term. And if elected, he would be refusing any presidential appointments that are offered to him. If he can't commit to that, then he shouldn't be running for Senate, because Delaware voters have the right to know that information before they cast their ballots. We should not be getting into a situation where Delawareans go to vote without that information, and then 3 months after potentially him being elected, he's stepping down from the role that they elected him to, taking the role as Secretary of State, and someone gets appointed to that seat that Delawareans didn't elect. Really, whether or not he's even considering accepting that role, I think it's something we should be extremely cautious about and clear on the record that Senator Coons has when it comes to foreign policy. Often people talk about Senator Coons having quite a bit of foreign policy experience, but I think beyond just having experience, it's important to note what's in that experience. Like, tenure and having done something for a while doesn't mean that you're qualified to do the job well if what you've pushed is not the type of policy that we should be pushing. And I think that's frankly where his foreign policy falls. He is particularly hawkish. He has imperialistic tendencies and doesn't necessarily look at things for the long term. And I think that it has been dangerous in the roles that he's played in the Senate. The things that he's said and the things that he's done have not necessarily well positioned us. And I think it would be even more harmful in a role like Secretary of State. For example, there's quite a few reasons that I think this appointment would not be good for our country. According to his own website, his philosophy is that the U.S. should use its military and economic power over other countries to make them conform to what he calls Western principles. What that means is that we would stay in endless war, we would continue extracting the resources of other countries for our own gain, and potentially kill millions of innocent people, creating further destabilization in an effort to make other countries conform to our ideals and impacting their sovereignty and their ability to be autonomous. In his own words, Senator Coons has said that he is a hawk. He's said that, quote unquote, within the Democratic Party, I tend to skew a little more towards the value of hard power, in which hard power means military might. this is not someone that I think should be in the role of Secretary of State. He also has a massive financial incentive for the U.S. to go to war, both personally with his family company of Gore being a military contractor and profiting from war, as well as just in this election as a whole, where he's taken tens of thousands of dollars, more than $46,000 from the defense industry. From just one company, he's taken more than $20,000, company Honeywell, who manufactures things like cluster bombs, military aircraft, missiles, weapons of war that companies like that stand to make a profit off of if we continue to be in endless war. Senator Coons has, as recently as this fall, when there were altercations between Iran and Saudi Arabia and altercations between Iran and the U.S. in Iraq, he's gone on Fox News and other cable news channels to advocate for going to war with Iran. He, in early 2018, voted against hearing a Democratic bill in the Senate that would have ended U.S. funding of the Saudi-led war in Yemen, bombing Yemeni civilians, including children. He voted to table that conversation and not hear the resolution. And he co-sponsored the Israel Anti-Boycott Act, which would have criminalized the acts of boycotting or divesting or putting sanctions against Israel, made it a criminal act to boycott. The ACLU, other organizations lobbied against this as an infringement on free speech, a bill that Senator Coons co-authored and co-sponsored. He has advocated for U.S. coups in countries like Venezuela and in Bolivia. He talks about the U.S. needing to maintain influence and power in the continent of Africa, as opposed to Africa leaning more towards the Chinese model, which has a few problems. For one, you can't refer to Africa as a monolith, as a single entity, which it very clearly is not. And it's incredibly imperialistic and colonialistic to talk about another continent in this way, as if its purpose is to serve us and our foreign policy or be modeled after us, as if we have the answers to how African countries should function. I think that these things are frankly disqualifying as a candidate for Secretary of State. We should not have someone as Secretary of State who is this hawkish, who is this imperialistic, and it's bad enough to have these things in the Senate. We absolutely do not need them in a Secretary of State. So that's first topic to address. I think that we will be calling on him to say that he will serve out the 6-year Senate term. I think if that is important to you, that's something that you should do as well. Next topic I want to hit on is about something we actually talked about last week. Last week we were talking about medical infrastructure and how we fund hospitals, and how the way that hospitals make money right now really makes it so that they prioritize things like elective surgeries, and they prioritize taking patients who have for-profit insurance. And then a few days after we talked about that, the News Journal put out an article talking about how Delaware hospitals are, as a whole, are losing about $5 million a day because of coronavirus. So what is happening is that they're losing money because they, again, rely on those elective surgeries and charging private insurance. And they can't do that right now because most elective surgeries have been shut down. So they're losing extreme amounts of money. And it's particularly important for hospitals that are in lower income or more rural communities, because they are already typically underfunded and really close to the line on being sustainable and maintaining the ability to function. So they're much more likely to go bankrupt as a result of a crisis like this, because they have even a smaller percentage of privately insured patients who come through the door. They tend to work on patients who are lower income and maybe Medicaid patients, and they tend to perform a smaller amount of those elective surgeries, so they are not bringing in as much of that money as it is even beforehand. So as always, this is how we see the effects of a crisis unfold disproportionately, and in effect, disproportionately lower income people, people in rural communities, people in Black or brown communities, again, are feeling the effects. And this is exactly why when people were saying like, oh, this virus doesn't discriminate, kind of, a few weeks ago you would hear that, like, oh, anyone can catch it. Maybe that's true, but what continues to be discriminatory are the care that people get, the hospitals they have access to, the medical care that they have access to is not the same. And I think that's incredibly important to keep reminding people of. That's like, yeah, maybe people can catch the disease. It doesn't necessarily discriminate in transmission, but we are seeing that Black and brown people are bearing the burden of the deaths and the cases that we're seeing. And that can really be tied to existing issues within our medical system, existing issues with the lack of care that exists in communities. And this crisis is only going to make that worse. Like we talked about last week, Representative Jayapal's Medicare for All bill fixes this issue of how we fund hospitals. It makes it so that we have a single payer system, so there's no longer this incentive to treat customers or patients who have private insurance over a Medicare patient or a Medicaid patient. And there's also a funding aspect that is incredibly important, that there would actually be a federal agency responsible for paying monthly stipends through a global budgeting system. So rather than hospitals having to find ways to make their own money and perform these certain types of procedures that are going to bring them in the most money and ignore other types of care that people need, the funding would actually be determined by that need rather than this quest for profit or income that's going to keep the hospital afloat. So those are a couple things that I wanted to start out talking about. I know there's at least one question that we got before we started, so I figured I'll hit that first as any more questions come in. So the one that we got beforehand was, what are your thoughts on Senator Hawley's quote-unquote getting America back to work COVID proposal? So if you don't know, Senator Hawley has put out this proposal. There are some good things in it. For example, the intention is to have workers keep their jobs for the duration of the pandemic, which is something that I have also said is what we should have done and should absolutely be doing even now, even though we've got 30 million people who have lost their insurance. Okay. What are you doing? Sorry, folks. Give me a second here. Got a dog running into the room. Great. Okay. Anyway, sorry about that. What were we talking about? We were talking about Senator Hawley's Getting America Back to Work bill. Got it. All right. So what were we talking about? We were saying there are some good things here. It's about keeping people... sorry. Sounds like people are saying they can't hear me. Let me try to fix it. Just seeing that now. Not sure how to fix that. Not sure what's going on. Let me try to... This is fun. This is fun for everybody to watch. Who doesn't want to watch live tech support? It's really awesome and enjoyable. Give me a sec. Let me see if I can make it any better. This is fun. All right. Can somebody tell me if it's better now? Okay. Some people seem they can hear me. Some people say they can. Some people say they can't. Hopefully it's better now. Anybody who couldn't hear me, can you tell me if it's better? In the meantime, I'm going to keep going and let me know if we're running into issues. All right. I'm sorry for starting this like 3 times. So we were talking about Senator Hawley's Getting America Back to Work bill. There are some good things here. The core of the bill is about helping workers by keeping them in their jobs. So that is what I believe we should have done from the beginning. We saw other countries do it. So rather than having millions of people, tens of millions of people end up on unemployment, what we would do instead is keep people attached to their jobs, keep people attached to their healthcare, which is unfortunately how we get healthcare right now, predominantly through our jobs, and the government make up their salaries. So we've seen this happen in a bunch of different countries where the government has chosen to ensure that people don't lose their jobs. There's a lot of reasons that this is desirable. One, you don't create the stress of people losing their job in the middle of a public health crisis and feeling like they need to go out and try to find another one, particularly if they're not sure that they're going to be able to go back to their job. And for people who maybe are getting unemployment, but it doesn't cover everything that they need, it's not enough to really sustain their household needs, they're going to want to get another job. And now we're going to have people searching for a job in the middle of a pandemic rather than being able to focus on staying healthy and staying home. The other part is that what always seems to happen when we have these recessions, when we have these mass layoffs and raising unemployment, is that when things come back, they never come back like they were. We were still coming out of 2008 recession right now. Not everyone had gone back to work. People had just dropped out of even looking for jobs. And the people who did go back to work, often they were going back to lower wage work or part-time work. Because what happens through a recession like this is that often companies will figure out, oh, we can do more with less. We can get by with 4 people when we used to have 6. People will work a little harder and we'll get more out of them, and we won't pay them more, but we'll get more productivity. So what always happens in a recession like this is that we get this constriction anyway. Even after things get better, fewer people have jobs to go back to. So yet another reason that we want to keep people attached to their jobs. There's also some good elements in his bill about preventing what's called crisis profiteering by Wall Street. So that's by Wall Street and by big companies kind of using the fact that so many companies are going to be struggling to gobble them up and create an even more monopolistic economy. So there are some good elements in the bill about that, which we obviously should be working to prevent during this time. We don't want to come out of this with only Walmart and Amazon as the only companies left. We were already quite close to that. And I think this is particularly relevant when we think about how so many small businesses are going to struggle to even come back if they can at all. And when we think about how many potential retail spaces might go bankrupt, how many condo buildings might go bankrupt, might not get, how many people might lose their homes. So there are people who see this as an opportunity. And there's parts in Senator Hawley's bill that are focused on preventing that from happening. There are some things I don't like in the bill, though. Number one is the way that he intends to fund keeping people on the payroll. So he intends to fund continuing to pay people's salaries by giving the companies a payroll tax rebate. Whenever you hear payroll taxes, what you should think is that those are the dollars that go toward Medicare and Social Security. So if you do, as Donald Trump was proposing and as Senator Hawley is proposing, if you do a payroll tax rebate or you do a payroll tax cut, that is money that is not making it into Medicare and Social Security. that weakens those programs, and it makes it easier for people to say, oh, we need to cut the coverage. We don't have enough money to cover everybody on Medicare. We don't have enough money to fund Social Security. Those things are not true. We have the money to do that, obviously. They want to use tools like payroll tax cuts to make up a reason why we have to cut social programs later. So that's something I just do not like about the bill, and I am completely opposed to funding things that way. Those programs should not be touched. There's also this emphasis in his bill and the way he talks about it, about like getting people back to their jobs. And while I agree with keeping people attached to their jobs, we should not be pushing people back to work, particularly if it is into a unsafe environment. He's really focused on like doing that as soon as possible, rather than saying as soon as it's safe. And we know there are people who are working right now in unsafe conditions. We do not need to be putting more people into that situation. There's also a feeling in his bill, and you'll see this in a lot of, this is why you have to always sort of be really careful and dig into the details of things, because his proposal says that, okay, we're going to replace your salary so we can cut things like strong unemployment benefits and a strong social safety net. And this is something we always have to be really cautious of, because keeping people employed does not mean we don't need a social safety net. There are still going to be people that lose their jobs no matter what. Like I said, there are going to be restaurants that don't open. There are going to be small businesses that don't come back from this. Those are going to be people who lose their jobs. There won't be an opportunity to keep them attached to their payroll. So we're still going to need a stronger safety net, and we should be building that safety net, not cutting it further. So that is something to always look out for, is like whenever someone is proposing a way to give someone some support or relief, it can't come at the cost of also cutting the already very small social safety net that we have. We should be expanding both of these things. We're more than capable of doing that. There's no reason that we have to have one or the other. I think a bill that I prefer, and she's getting a lot of shout outs from me today, but Representative Jayapal's put a bill forward, the Paycheck Guarantee Act, which addresses that same principle of keeping people associated with their jobs and on payrolls, but it's coming from, the funding is not by essentially cutting social programs like Medicare and Social Security. All right, so Jean asked a question. If you were in the Senate right now, instead of Chris Coons, would you have voted on extending $600 a week unemployment addition until January? I heard Chris Coons would not. Yeah, absolutely. We know that, like I just said, this recovery is not, people kept talking about, oh, it's going to be a V-shaped recovery. A bunch of people will lose their jobs, but they'll come right back. I think that is a pipe dream. I think we have seen that while there are some people who think their unemployment might be temporary, like I just said about 2008, things don't just bounce back. Companies are always going to be incentivized to try to save money, and they can save money. The most expensive part of most companies is their workers. So if there's an opportunity for them to not bring workers back, they're not going to bring workers back. So we know that people are going to be on unemployment for a long time, and we know that there's a possibility, strong possibility, that we have a second wave of coronavirus infections, people are saying, in the fall. So if we end that extra $600 a month provision, and rather than extending it for, a lot of people are saying till January of next year, we're going to have a lot of people that fall through the cracks and who are not going to be able to survive this crisis. So absolutely, yes, I would continue to extend that $600. I think that we should also be doing monthly payments of $2,000 to every single person to ensure that they are stable through this crisis. And that is actually the way you stimulate the economy through a crisis or a recession, is you get money, like sizable amounts of money, into the hands of individual people. That is how you keep businesses afloat. We know this. We just never seem to have people in office who want to actually fight to do that. And that is a lot, that it comes back to something that we talk about a lot. It's like, how do you actually put people over the profits? corporations are not constituents. People are. And that's who we should be voting for and legislating for. All right, Jean had another question. Do you think our current administration has done a good job with handling this pandemic? No, absolutely not. This has been a complete failure, and we should be saying that every opportunity. This is not acceptable. We have 2,000 people dying a day. I think I didn't look at the numbers today. We are up over 90,000 people who have died. This has not been handled well. We went into lockdown 2 months ago with the assumption that over that time, we're going to try to figure out testing. We're going to scale up testing. We're going to scale up PPE. We're going to scale up what's called tracing, so that if you do test positive, there are people who can do the work to contact the people who you may have come in touch with. None of that has been done. We basically were told to stay home for 2 months. We got very little support to do that. And now people are struggling. I think something like 5 million people didn't pay rent on May 1st. And we're 2 months down the line and we're not in any better position. We still aren't testing enough. We still have people saying they don't want to test more because they don't want the numbers to look bad. But if you don't test people, you don't know where the infection is. And what should have been done is ramp up testing, test everyone, quarantine people who are positive, and ensure that they don't infect anyone else, and trace the contacts for them so that people know they may have been exposed so they can come in and get tested. This is, when the countries that we've seen handle this successfully, that is what has been done. So I jumped the gun. Jean had some other questions here. But no, I do not think this administration has done a good job of it. We had Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar. You've probably heard me talk about him before. Chris Coons lobbied to get him confirmed, vouched for him, said he would handle the job competently. Literally hired a dog breeder to run a task force. Was on TV this weekend saying things like, oh, well, this is affecting, Black and brown communities worse because they have higher rates of comorbidities and they're more likely to be obese and less likely to have good health. Blaming people for being sick. These are the people we have leading this. No, I don't think the response has been adequate at all. So I remember H1N1 too. We didn't close the country. HIV didn't close the country. HIV spreads differently, so I think that's important to note. I would also say, though, that that was an epidemic that was handled incredibly poorly. Hundreds of thousands of people died from HIV before there was any acknowledgement that something was going on here and it needed to be addressed. So they're different, but we saw the same just cruel response. And I think that's what's been so disheartening about this response right now, is that it has felt genuinely cruel and it has felt like a complete failure, because I believe that the reason we have government is to take care of people, to support people. And we have completely seen that fail to happen, both from a medical standpoint and from a economic standpoint. We didn't move nearly as quickly as we should have. We are now championing 90,000 people being dead as a success because there were, numbers that said it could be 1 million. Well, we're still not done. We're not through this. Then, there were numbers that said it could be 200,000. Well, it still feels like it could be 200,000, and that's with the lockdown in place, and we're still over 90,000 deaths. And I think the way that it's been particularly cruel is in this seeming dismissal of people who are dying. There's been this idea that because maybe it's predominantly older people who are dying, or people who are living in nursing homes or assisted care facilities, that we shouldn't care. And that's just a vile attitude from my perspective. Like, we should not be saying one life is worth less or more than any other. and acting like it's okay if it's only affecting older people or poorer people or people who people in power seem to see as expendable. And it's been particularly cruel in the economic response. I mean, like I said, people are not surviving right now. We need to have stronger unemployment. We need to have guaranteed sick leave so that people who are sick can actually stay home without fear of losing their jobs or losing income. We need to see workplaces that are actually forced to be safe. I mean, we're in a situation where OSHA has stopped enforcing safety, and they're basically operating on a we think the workplaces will be safe. We know that's not true. We need enforcement, and without enforcement, companies are going to cut corners, and they're going to force employees into unsafe conditions. We need to create a country where people aren't constantly living from paycheck to paycheck. And this exists outside of coronavirus. Like, I think we have to constantly remember that all of this, these precarious situations, existed before this. This has just thrown gasoline on the fire and has exposed it to more and more people. But so many people knew this was what life was already like. This is how people were already living life. Unable to take off because they're sick. Fearful of losing their job if they take a day off, unable to survive if they go on unemployment. So, no, I don't think this response has been adequate from either a public health standpoint or from an economic standpoint. Another question, how do you feel about us reopening Delaware in phases? So I'm not opposed to the idea of phases. I mean, that seems to make sense. I do think, though, that there's been this conversation about, like, it's either we have economy or we have lockdown or we have safety. And I just don't think that that is true. Like I said before, we have the ability to keep people on their payrolls, to give them a stimulus throughout this period. We have the money to do that and to treat people with dignity, and if we genuinely care about keeping them safe, and we've failed to do that. So I think that there's not an issue with reopening in phases. There is an issue with reopening because you're getting pressure from the Chamber of Commerce or other business advocates, not even though the public health indicators would say otherwise. You know, the announcement that we were going to open the beaches before Memorial Day came on the day that we had the 4th highest number of new cases and the highest number of deaths. So when I see we're opening the beaches, but we've just had the most deaths, and then I think actually the next day we had even more deaths and broke that record again, that to me says that we're probably not in a place where, from a public health standpoint, we should be opening. But again, the concept of like economy being closed and people being safe they don't have to be opposites. Like we can keep people safe and not have our entire economy collapse. The reason our entire economy collapsed is the failure of the stimulus to go to the places that it needed to go. When we see things like the paycheck loans, the PPP loans for small businesses, the amount of large businesses, mega corporations that were able to scoop funds out of that pool, the fact that people were really restricted in the way that they could use it, so that it was only paycheck or predominantly paycheck money, which meant that if you don't spend 75% of it on your paychecks, you're going to have to pay it back. But some people need to be able to pay their rent to keep their business. Some people need to be able to pay other bills. So those restrictions actually have made it harder in some cases for people to actually use that money and ensure that they're not going to have to pay it back. If we had instead said, we're going to pay to keep people on payrolls, we're going to give small businesses a stimulus so that they can pay their rent and their bills through this and keep themselves solvent, and we're going to boost unemployment so that anyone who does lose their job is taken care of, maybe we'd be in a better place. But we've done this kind of hodgepodge effort that hasn't been nearly enough and hasn't been direct enough to really prevent this economic collapse. So what we have instead is people demanding that things reopen, not because they feel safe necessarily, but because there's no other way for them to feel supported through this. All right, so Simon asked the question, do we think we should clean house on both parties? And I'm assuming he's asking, do I think we need like a totally new Congress and totally different people? I think we need to elect a lot more people who are going to be laser focused on and willing to stand up and fight for a dignified standard of living for every single person in this country. And I think that needs to exist at all levels of government. And I think that includes people who are going to fight for universal health care and free education, from extending the promise of free education, because sure, we have grade school now, but we need childcare, we need pre-K, we need trade schools, we need college and grad school. We need a commitment to actually creating a clean environment and stopping climate change in its tracks. So we should be looking at every level of government to find people who are going to fight for those principles. I think there are some people who are elected right now who wait to see where they think public opinion is going or has gone, and then they react. So maybe those people could be brought along, but we've got to get a lot more people who are going to lead and fight in office to ever have a chance of bringing those people along. I think that right now, if you really think about the number of people who are committed to those principles of prioritizing people over profit, it's a really small percentage of Congress. And what we need to do is find a way to get more and more people who are committed to those principles in office, and we will start to see the tide shift, I believe. So Ravi asked a question. I'm curious how you're getting required campaign contributions as of now during these difficult times. It's a really great question. And, fundraising is always hard. It's, when you aren't getting money from corporate donors or corporate PACs and you need to fund grassroots, it's always a challenge. It requires me being on the phone, reaching out to people, trying to find new people, doing things like this that are going to bring new people in, asking you to invite your friends to come to the next one so they get brought in as well. Looking for like-minded candidates or issues and seeing who donates to those campaigns to try to broaden our base that way. So there's a lot of work that goes into fundraising a campaign this way. However, I wouldn't trade that work for taking corporate PAC money, because the principle of not being beholden to any corporate donors is incredibly important to this campaign. So fundraising is always a challenge. It's always a lot of work, at least. And I think in March, I was really unsure of how fundraising would go or how people would react. So I think, when this first happened, and frankly, when we first couldn't canvass, I think we all kind of took a week or so where we just kind of reassessed and thought about, what are we going to do? How are we going to approach this differently? It was also, it's also just a emotionally and even physically draining time in the very beginning of this when we were trying to adjust to what our lives were going to be like. But what happened instead is that we've had consistently good fundraising months. And I think that's because a lot of people recognized that if we had the things that I am fighting for right now in place before this, we would have been in such a better place going into this. People are seeing that if we had universal health care in the beginning, people wouldn't have been afraid to get tests because they were afraid of how much it would cost or how much the treatment would cost. Rightfully so. There were people who were uninsured who got bills for $30,000 for COVID-19 treatment. If we had universal health care, that concept would have gone away and people wouldn't have been afraid to find out if they were infected. Same thing with paid leave, same thing with expanding unemployment or having that stronger safety net. So we have had really good fundraising months. April was our best fundraising month of the campaign. I'm hoping that May can be even better. I think because people recognize that this is the platform that will make our lives better, that they are willing to, those who can have been willing to give. And they've been willing to give either through fundraising and giving dollar donations, but we also have people who have stepped up to say, I'm willing to volunteer and donate my hours and my time too. And we've expanded our roster of volunteers dramatically during this time. I think that if I were running on a platform that said we should be maintaining the private insurance industry and keeping the profit motive in healthcare and telling people that their insurance company is allowed to ration their care and make decisions about what things will cost them, and that they don't deserve paid leave and that they don't deserve higher wages, I think we maybe would be running into worse fundraising than we are. But I think because of the platform, people are willing to support right now. All right. All right, so a question about, should Delaware offer more incentives for people on Medicaid, like get more insurers? Right now we only have 2 choices. I'm on Medicaid, and our states that border us offer Medicaid clients more insurers than we do in Delaware, which needs to do better for the DHSS and low-income people in Delaware. Yeah, I mean, these are some of the issues that we run into with our current system. Even when you are on Medicaid, you don't always have this freedom of choice that we hear about so much. We always hear like, oh, our system is great because people have choice. I made a video actually earlier this week about how I have, quote unquote, or last week, excuse me, I have quote unquote good insurance, but there's a lot of ways that it really fails me. And choice and where I can use my insurance is definitely one of them. This is one of the things that we need to fight to change with Medicare for All. The idea that you should be locked into certain doctors or only accepted by certain doctors needs to go completely away. When we have a single payer system, there is no other option for doctors or medical centers to take. So every doctor is available to you. Every hospital is available to you, medical center, urgent care, whatever that may be. This concept of out of network or out of reach for you needs to go completely away. At the beginning of the stream, I was talking about how right now we have a situation where for hospitals and doctors, it's more profitable to treat people who have private insurance. So those patients can often get priority or get easier access to treatment than someone on Medicare or Medicaid can. That would also go away if we all were coming with the same quote unquote plan. And I honestly hate calling Medicare for All a plan because it's not a plan. It's just the ability to go to a doctor and not have bills follow you afterward, not have to figure out whether this person is in network or out of network, whether this is a deductible charge or not. All of these things that we spend our time thinking about would go away. And there would no longer be this unnecessary administration. This is something else that I think when we talk about Medicare for All, we talk about how it saves money. And I think sometimes that trips people up because they see this, they've heard the price tag of, it'll cost $3 trillion a year. Well, right now we spend about $3.5 trillion a year on healthcare as a country. The savings comes from the fact that this administrative overhead goes away. Every dollar that you put into our healthcare system right now, about 20 to 25% of it, if it's in a private insurance, if you are running through private insurance, goes to administrative costs. So every time I pay $1, a quarter of it goes into just paying the insurance company to do its business. So every time I'm paying $1, I'm really only paying 75 cents. And that's what drives up costs and makes things more expensive. I need to look up the numbers exactly, but Medicare and Medicaid are closer to under 5% administrative costs. They run much more efficiently. So when we transition to that system, our dollars go further, and that's where that savings comes from. It also comes from the fact that because people will have actual choice and can go to whatever doctor they want to whenever they need to, people will go to the doctor when they need to, which a lot of times people don't right now. They put it off. And what happens is conditions get worse, and then the treatment they need is actually more severe as that disease or that injury or whatever it may be has progressed, and that is more costly to treat than had we caught it in the beginning. So yes, I completely agree that this is a problem when you can only go to certain places to use Medicaid. That's a problem we need to fix, and it's fixed by moving to a single payer system. Oh, this is fun. Okay. Kyler asked a question. If all the progressive candidates made it into Congress and Senate, which are you most excited to work with? This is fun. Okay. Well, we have Michaela Wilkes in Maryland, who is running against Steny Hoyer, and actually her election is, just a couple weeks away. So very excited for her. We're kind of local to us and close by, so we've, spoken to their campaign and have watched her do her work, and we're really proud of the work that she's done and hope to see her win. There's also Isan Leckie, who's running in Massachusetts, and Jamal Bowman, who's running in New York. That's just a few. I think, I'm a brand new Congress endorsed candidate, and the entire slate there I encourage you all to check out because there are some fantastic candidates there. I think on the Senate side, there's a really good group that are also BNC candidates that I would love to serve with. So we've got Kimberly Graham, who's running in Iowa, Charles Booker in Kentucky, Paula Jean Swearingen in West Virginia, and Betsy Sweet in Maine. So I would be incredibly honored to serve with all of them, any of them, hopefully all of them. And I think that some of those wins would really start to put us on track to get that Congress we were talking about for that is really people focused. So Steve asked how you appeal to moderates and right-leaning Democrats who may think you're too progressive. It's interesting. I think the best way, and what we've really tried to do with our campaign by canvassing and now phone banking, is really to have one-on-one conversations with people. I know that I'm not necessarily going to win over every single person, but I think that when myself or volunteers on our team have the opportunity to talk to voters, there's always something that we can find that is something they've experienced personally that they can connect to, and they recognize that it was not the way it should have been. For some people, it's healthcare. For some people, it's just I got cancer and lost my job, so I lost my health insurance, and then I ended up bankrupt. And they recognize that's not the way that things should work. I start most of my conversations with people by saying, I think in the wealthiest country in the world, there's no excuse for so many people to be struggling. And most people agree with that right off the bat. So I get agreement with the first statement that I make with most people. And it might be that what's important to you is that you've got a couple kids who are about to go to college and you're not sure how you're going to pay for it. Or maybe you're going to pay for it, but you're not sure how you're going to be able to pay for everything else, and it's going to push you really close to the line, and you're going to struggle just to be able to do that. Why should you have to do that? We don't have to make people struggle and make the ability to pay a barrier for education. Particularly, every parent wants what's best for their child. They're going to try to do as much as they possibly can. But why should they have to struggle to give their kid an education? They recognize that that's not right. And maybe they're not even bought in on it in the beginning, but we can talk about how we can fund that. We can talk about why things like housing and healthcare and education and a clean environment are things we all deserve. And there's almost always something in the platform that I can find a way to connect with someone on. So I think it's about those one-on-one conversations. I've had when we were out canvassing, and I'd always try to talk to people who were just walking on the street too. I had like a 15-minute conversation with the woman I just met on the street who was a registered Republican. And just in talking to her about the things that I believe and care about, I'm not saying she was like going to change her party affiliation, but we came to an agreement that like things don't have to be the way that they are, and that we can imagine a world that's better, and that we should be taxing the wealthiest people in our country and the corporations in our country, and that people should be paying their fair share into our social programs when they aren't right now. And most people believe that corporate money doesn't belong in politics. That's another place where it's really easy to get agreement. Like, most people say that they want a senator who's going to fight for them, not legislate in favor of corporations who line their pockets. So it depends on the person, really, how you win them over. But I think it's important to remember that things like Medicare for All, particularly, is actually the pragmatic policy. Like, it is, people want to call it radical as a way to combat it. It's absolutely not. It saves 70,000 lives a year and $450 billion a year. That's pragmatism. That's looking at the options and saying we have one system that leads to more death and suffering and cost, and we have another system that can alleviate those things. The pragmatic choice would be to save lives and save money. I think the same thing can be said for the Green New Deal. We know that climate change is going to impact our lives. We have to take the reins and decide what that impact looks like. And if we just let things run and we take kind of incremental steps towards trying to fix that, it's going to look like more disease, more pandemics, more storms and unpredictable weather. It's going to look like 10% of Delaware at a minimum being underwater in a generation. It's going to look like more flooding downstate, and here in Wilmington, it's going to look like more beach erosion and more saltwater intrusion killing our farmland. And that's just stuff here in Delaware. So if we take these baby steps, that's what climate change will look like. But it could look like the US leading and saying, we're going to take the reins and drive it in a different direction. Why wouldn't we want to be the leader in green technologies and green infrastructure and green energy? Why would we ever say that we want someone else to take the lead on that? It makes no sense. We could be the people that are creating the most effective solar panels and wind turbines and batteries for storing energy. We could be the people that are making green public transportation and investing in ourselves and controlling what our future actually looks like. I don't know why we would leave something like that up to chance. So I think it's really about, again, those one-on-one conversations and finding that thing that's going to resonate with an individual. They don't have to agree with the whole platform, but a lot of people can find something that's going to make either their life or the life of someone they love better in the platform that we're fighting for. And at the very least, they're going to believe that I'm trying to get there to fight for them, not for corporate interests and for my corporate donors, because they don't exist. All right. So Jean asked another question about elections. So to clarify, this race it's in the chat too, but it's the Delaware primary, which is on September 15th of this year. So why can't we have healthcare like in Canada and have insurance be mandatory but not penalize us for not having insurance? We absolutely can. We just need to get people in office that are going to fight for it. I mean, that is one of the things that I think was so frustrating about the Affordable Care Act for a lot of people, was they were required to have insurance, but they were required to pay a private company to have that insurance, rather than we're going to require you have insurance by giving it to you, by giving you health care. And this idea of forcing people to pay a private company rather than granting people the ability to go to a doctor, I think was really a flaw that has led to a lot of the frustration with that bill, because people were forced into plans that maybe they can't afford, because even if they can afford the monthly premium, maybe it comes with a really high deductible. So now you're spending, as an example, I looked at plans in the marketplace in Delaware last year during open enrollment. And I think I did a hypothetical of two people making $10 an hour trying to get coverage. And the options were, the cheapest option was a plan that was $300 a month with an $8,000 deductible. Now, you got subsidies with that plan, which meant that it would take your monthly payment down to about $70 a month. But if anything changed during the year, if your partner got a better job and suddenly they're making $20 a year, or you got a better job or hour and now you're making $20 an hour, that subsidy may no longer apply and you might owe it back come tax time. Plus, you have this $8,000 deductible. If you're making $30,000 a year, that's like a quarter of your income going to your deductible. So that means you're going to spend like a quarter of your income just to get to a place where your insurance company starts paying. So that is something that I think has made people really angry, that they feel like they're being forced to buy a product that they can't even use. And that while even if they get a subsidy to cover the costs, there's always this fear that if, my life slightly improves and I get a raise or I get another job that pays more, that I'll actually end up worse off because I will get penalized for needing to now pay that back come tax time. So we absolutely can have a better system. We need people who are going to fight for it, both in Congress and on the ground. I mean, we know that the American people support this. Something like 69% of Americans, all Americans, no party affiliation aside, support a single payer healthcare system. That is beyond having the favor of public opinion. So we need to elect people who are going to fight for it and promise to fight for it and are running on it. And we need to continue the pressure from the grassroots and from the public to say, I won't reelect you if you don't support this policy. I will show up at your office or show up in your inbox or show up on your voicemail if you don't support this policy, because that is the only way we're going to get it, through either electing people who are going to fight for it and continuing to push those people that we elect to fight for it. All right, that's 8:30. If anybody's got a final question, a quick one maybe, throw it in there. Let me see, there's a couple more here. KJ asked a question, why do you think the Democratic Party is having a hard time getting people to vote? I think even despite pandemic, I think there were decent turnout numbers for, like, for example, presidential primary this year. I think what's tough is that our system's not easy to navigate. Take Delaware, for example. We've got 3 different dates that you may have to vote this year. And that's not even counting like school board elections, or if you're in, for example, Christina School District and there's a referendum to vote on to fund your school district, which please look that up if you're in the Christina School District. So there's 3 dates: our presidential primary date, our statewide primary date, and our general election. We also have closed primaries. So if you aren't a registered Democrat or a registered Republican, you can't even participate in the state primary or in the primary elections. So that kind of cuts out a whole lot of people who choose to not be affiliated with the party. We don't have vote by mail in our state, which makes it harder to get people to turn out. We don't make Election Day a holiday. And even if it was a holiday, we know there's quite a few people who still have to work on holidays. But we don't make it a holiday, so a lot of people are working. And in places where there's fewer polling places or machines don't function properly and some get shut down and we get lines that are hours long, a lot of people can't do that. They either have to get to work, they have to get to class, they just don't want to stand in a line for 3 hours to vote. I think there are a lot of things that make it harder for people to vote that we should absolutely be trying to clear the path. Um, and I think that particularly when it comes to primary elections, like we have to work pretty hard to get people to turn out because they're not always people aren't always made aware of what the primary is, when it is, why they should vote in it, who's running. Like these are things that really create barriers to people engaging with elections. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to actually make it so that voting is as easy as possible, so that we can increase turnout, so that we expand the ways you can vote. So either by mail or by getting a ballot and dropping it off, having a window when you can vote rather than a single day. Things come up on a single day. If you suddenly your kid's sick and you were planning on voting, but now your kid's sick, maybe you choose not to vote that day, or you want to but you can't. So there's a lot of things that I think we can do from just a approach to how elections work and how we communicate about them that could really improve the engagement with them. All right. I think that's it. Um, so to wrap up, as always, please consider volunteering. You can go to jessfordelaware.com/volunteer. We always can use more volunteers. We are phone banking every day, and we always need people who can help us do that. The more people we can get on the dialer to make calls, the more calls we can make. So please consider that. If you're a supporter of this campaign, we'd love to have your voice and your willingness to share with other people why you support. Like I mentioned before with those one-on-one conversations, like that's really what resonates with people. And when they hear from a volunteer that, oh, I support this campaign because I want Medicare for all because of XYZ thing that happened in my life, that's how you connect with people and how you bring them along. So please consider signing up to volunteer. If you are able to make a donation, they are always welcome. As I mentioned before, fundraising is one of the hardest things for grassroots candidates and challenger candidates. It's always going to be a challenge. So if you're able to make a donation, much appreciated. Like even $1 goes a long way. $1 means we can call 18 more people. So if you're able to make a donation, please consider it at jessfordelaware.com/donate. And otherwise, if there's anything in the chat that we can follow up on, we'll do that. And, we'll be here next Monday to talk more. Thanks so much. Have a great night. Bye.